Awesome. Well, it is good to be with all of you guys tonight and finish off this spring semester. And it is, like Carla mentioned earlier, it is pretty crazy to think that this thing that we all set off to do, study through the whole Bible, that we set out in September to accomplish, we are a year in. It's pretty crazy to me. I'll be honest, I'm ready for a break. It has been a huge blessing to me to study in this capacity, and I have been praying that it would be a blessing to you guys as well. And as Carla mentioned earlier, we are going to spend the last 10 minutes or so celebrating our Awana kids and all their awards. And so we're going to review from September up until this last week. That's what we're going to do tonight. So if you didn't get notes out in the hallway, I would encourage you to do so, especially if you are newer and if you're a note taker, because there's a reason why we do these reviews and introductions at the beginning of every semester, if you will, right? We kicked it off with an introduction last time. We reviewed in December. We started an introduction in January, and now we're reviewing again. And so you might wonder, why are we doing so many reviews? It's because we have the privilege here at Highland of getting new people. And we want to make sure that you are caught up, that you don't feel like in this 3-year study, that because you came in 6 months into it, you're just completely lost, right? It'd be like watching a show on some streaming service, and you start in season 3, and you're like, is there a chance to go back and watch it? Because that's what I want to do. That's what these lessons are for. Okay, and so we are going to go back and review the entire story that we have covered so far from Genesis up to and through Ecclesiastes, which we covered last week. And so I'm excited for this. And because we've got this renovation going with all these beautiful slides, I'm also really excited for that, to look at something pretty on screen other than this white slide that is just like glaring in our face. And so before we jump in and really start reviewing, I want to ask you guys just this question, and I do want your feedback. I want to know what you think. Because this semester we did cover the historical portions of the Bible, right? Joshua through 2 Chronicles, and then we also covered the wisdom literature. And so I want to hear from you guys as you look back on what we've studied this spring. Why is it important to study the historical portions of the Bible? See where we came from? What do you mean by that? Yeah, it's where we came from. Yeah. Yep, the beginning of things. Yep, good. What else? What do you think? What do you mean? Sure. You have to understand the stories in context. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, for a long time, I felt like I understood certain Bible stories or maybe moral truths that would come out of Bible stories, but I couldn't situate them in any grander narrative. So I knew the Bible stories, their significance to the canon of Scripture as a whole, I couldn't really tell you that. And that's why that's important, so that we don't just understand kind of pithy moral statements, but when we look at this book, we can say, I know what this book is about. Like, I have a good understanding of this, right? Yeah, really good. Why else? Why would you consider it important to study the historical portions of the Bible? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's a really interesting point, Rhonda. So what I have found, and let me know if this is true of you as well, It's one thing to learn about God through systematic theology, which is, we've studied systematic theology here. It's a good and valuable pursuit, but that's where you're talking about like propositional statements of the attributes of God. So what is God? He is wise. He is omnipotent. He is omniscient. And you learn all these attributes and their definitions. It's a different thing to study God in the context of the story. It'd be like me describing my dad to you and versus you going and spending a week at his house. Like you would just learn so much more than just the descriptions. And it doesn't mean that I'm lying when I give you those descriptions. But the story helps us to understand how God is working in history, how he's working with his people, this whole thing, right? It's what we call biblical theology. Not that systematic theology is unbiblical, okay? We're not going to teach unbiblical theology here. But yeah, the story it helps us to understand more deeply those propositions and those definitions, but we need that story. Right, why is he gracious? Well, we've seen all these instances, these situations where he's incredibly merciful, right? Yeah, Mark, what do you think? I'm excited to get to the New Covenant when we talk about kind of its foreshadowings in the prophets, but then also when we get to the New Testament. And my plan is to take all these threads from these studies that we've had in the fall and this spring and in this upcoming fall with the prophets. We're going to take all these threads that we've been kind of weaving through the story, and they're all going to tie together in Christ. And hopefully we'll be able to do that in a way that is very impactful, that helps us see, like, again, that grander narrative. And it's not just like, oh, we just have definitions about Christ and he is this way just because it kind of says he is. No, we'll see how the story all leads to him, right? Really good. Dennis, what do you think? Man, Matthew 5:17. Do you not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets? I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And we think that means Jesus accomplished it and then he threw it away. That's not what that means. And that's what I grew up thinking. He threw it away. We don't need it anymore. And it's like, no. Oh, man. Dennis, you're about to get me started on a whole different sermon, okay? It's just a very bad idea. It's very theologically bad idea to think that he started some anti-Old Testament revolution in the New Testament. No, that's not what he did. He's completing it. It's shown in him. And so we're going to talk about that a lot more in a year. So just wait for that. But there are a lot of reasons we could give for that, why study the historical portions of the Bible. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to ask you this second question, but it's also so important to study the wisdom literature, which we're going to cover again soon, right? Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and then Psalms and Song of Solomon aren't really the wisdom literature, but we can kind of lump it in with those to give us tools for life, which we're going to talk about soon. And so what we've done this spring, my point is this: it's important. It's important. These sections of the Bible are not optional. We don't get to sideline them and say, no, I'll take the Psalms, but I'll leave 2nd Chronicles. I'll take Proverbs, but I'll leave Ecclesiastes. We don't get to do that because all of them have gifts, just riches of God's wisdom. They open the door for us to understand and then enter into the story of God. And so when we get to our lives as New Testament believers in a year, in 2026, all these things are going to tie together and have so much relevance to your life. And so it's not just Genesis and Exodus, which is kind of like especially Genesis, kind of the prologue of the story, right? But even all the way up through the historical portions, it's just necessary for us. And it's a gift that God has given us in his word for our good, okay? Excuse me. Now, if you guys are newer or weren't here last semester or the beginning of this semester, one of the reasons that we've started this Thrive study, this Wednesday night curriculum, if you will, studying through the entire story of God in 3 years, 2.5 years in the Bible, and then the last 4 or 5 months or so in church history, is because we believe that when you get to know God really well, and you get to know yourself really well, you can be the person that God is calling you to be. You can live effectively for Christ. And in order to get to know God well and yourself well, you have to know this book. You have to know this book. And this book is a giant story. And the even better part than that is that it's a true story. It actually happened. And so if we know this book really well, you can know God really well. You can know what he's doing, what he has done in the world, what he wants to do in the world right now, what he's going to do in the world in the future. And then you can look at your own life and say, I have a purpose and a mission and a calling from God to participate in that story. It's not just acts of God that he did in the past, and it's like, let's admire them, and that's it. No, we get to live with the Lord now, because that story is continuing through me and through you, through the church today. And so our goal really was, we want to get to know this book, and we want to equip you guys for the work of ministry. We want you to be effective for the sake of Christ in the world. And so we started mapping out what would it look like to study the Bible over 2.5 years. And so we began last September with session 1. Oh, it's not there. That is such a bummer. All right, where I was going to have beautiful slides for you all, and they're just this. So less distracting, that's fine. But we started off with this idea of the master plan. The master plan. This is from Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And the Bible opens by revealing God to us as creator. He's unbelievably brilliant and powerful. And he comes on the scene creating everything in the universe. In Hebrew, the heavens and the earth. There was no Hebrew word for universe, right? It's everything. And so he comes on the scene as a creator, and then he creates people in his image. And he gives them this command. He gives them a commission, a mandate, that he doesn't give any of the other created things. He creates them in his image and then says, I want you to make something of the world with me. And so if we look back at God's creation of mankind, we need to be able to answer that question, why did he create the world? Or why did he create people? What was his purpose? It wasn't because he was lonely. It's because he created them to be representatives of him on the earth and to make order, to bring order out of chaos. And so we said that this master plan, if you will, from the beginning, is that God's glory will cover the earth through the exercise of godly dominion by humanity, which is made in his image. And so Adam and Eve are made to be representatives of God. And by creating order out of chaos through them and their descendants, they would collectively, not individually, I don't think, but collectively reflect the character of God. They are the image of God. And by creating order from chaos, they would partner with God in making something of the world. And so God makes with Adam this Adamic covenant. You guys remember this? This Adamic covenant, the covenant with Adam, that's all that means. But he says, I want you to be partners with me. All you have to do is not eat of the fruit of the tree, this one tree of knowledge and good and evil. You need to trust me. And we said that there were these two words that start with S that really defined, oh, sweet, thanks, Adam. These two words that really defined what life was like before sin entered the world. They both start with S. What are they? Okay, shalom, which is peace. It's harmony. It's more than just not being at war. It's everything functioning like it's supposed to. So that's shalom. And then Shabbat, right? Rest. Adam and Eve found their identity in just being with God. And so it's not the creation of man that is the peak of the creation week. It's actually the seventh day, the day of rest, when God just looks at his creation and says, this is really good. And they just enjoy communion with one another. Now, after that, we get to session 2, chapters 3 through 6. We know that in chapters 1 and 2, everything is just perfect. But in chapter 3 of Genesis, everything goes wrong. Sin and temptation enter into the world. And we said that sin is much more than just breaking rules. That's not how we should think about that. It's not just I did something wrong and God doesn't like when you break rules because he really is about the rules. And so if you break the rules, he doesn't like you. That's not him. Sin and temptation wasn't just do something wrong. It was, did God really say you shouldn't actually trust God because he's trying to withhold something from you, this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you ate it, you'd be wise like God. And so God doesn't have your best in mind. He is giving you boundaries at your expense, which is not why God originally did it. He said, I'm going to give you boundaries for your good. But sin and temptation say, no, you shouldn't actually trust God. You shouldn't know when to say enough. Be like an animal. Animals they run on instinct, right? They run on instinct. What they instinctually feel, they do. And so God is saying to Adam and Eve, no, you're not animals. You need to know when to say enough to your own desire. And rather than being ruled by the inner voice of desire, you should be ruled by the voice of God that comes from without, that comes from outside of you. And so when God speaks, are you going to obey that, or are you going to obey just what is in here? And so we said that sin begins here. I'm not going to trust God. That's really the heart of it. I'm not going to trust God. But then it results in disruption of shalom, disruption of peace. It's like a beautiful orchestra playing something, and then one instrumentalist introducing discord into the entire thing, and you go, whoa, stop. You're messing everything up. That's sin in the cosmos, right? This is a forfeiture of Shabbat. You don't have rest anymore because you have said, I'm going to define what's right and wrong, not God. This is what Adam and Eve are doing. Sin tramples upon God's good creation. And so sin is driven by fear, insecurity, and scarcity. It's a scarcity mindset. There's not enough to go around. God doesn't have my best in mind, and so I need to take control for myself. It's not trust. And we saw in Genesis chapter 3:15, this promise that God gives. We call it the proto-euangelion, where he says, I will fix everything that has gone wrong. The first gospel, the offspring of Eve is going to crush the offspring of the snake who deceived her, right? And he will crush the serpent's head, but the serpent will bite his heel. And so he will be wounded in the process of defeating evil. And so this promise of God, from Genesis 3, we're really looking for that promise to be fulfilled for the rest of the scriptures, because it's very... It's almost a very simple promise. He's going to defeat evil. But as the story progresses, evil is going to grow and take on all these different facets. And so that promise is going to be it's going to need to be able to handle all that, right? But we see it first in Genesis chapter 3. And then in Genesis 3, we're introduced to the first major problem of the narrative. As God has said he's going to fix all things, what is he going to do about this first major problem, which is death and cursing of the land? Because now that humankind has sinned, they will die. God told them that's what would happen. But the land is also cursed. It brings forth thorns. It fights against man when he's trying to cultivate it, okay? And so there's death and cursing of the land. What is God going to do about that? Then we get to session 3. I'm going to leave it up to you there, Adam. Awesome. Thanks, dude. We get to session 3, Genesis 6 through 11. These are the stories of the flood and the Tower of Babel, right? And so after sin begins in this couple, Adam and Eve, it then extends to their family in Cain and Abel in Genesis chapter 4. But then by the time you get to Genesis chapter 6, evil has gone from one family to this city, now to the entire world. And we see in Genesis chapter 6 that the intention of everybody's heart is only to do evil all the time. And it says God looks down on humanity and his heart grieves. He grieves because every good thing he had planned for them, they are forfeiting. And again, at their own expense. And so he calls this guy Noah. He says, Noah, you are blameless among this generation, and so build me an ark. Build an ark, and this is going to be the means by which I save you, your family, the animal kingdom, and everyone else is going to be destroyed. And so Noah does that. After God floods the earth, Noah gets off the ark, and God makes with him the Noahic covenant. So we had the covenant with Adam first, right? Then we got the covenant with Noah, where God says, I will never flood the earth in judgment again. And it's really a reinstitution of the Adamic covenant. All those commands God had given to Adam, like be fruitful and multiply, make something of the world with me, all of those promises are given right back to Noah as this fresh start in the narrative. And so we think maybe God has, at this point with Noah, maybe he's overcome the second major problem, which we saw at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, which is the wicked human heart. So we have death and cursing of the land first. Now we've got this other problem that God's got to overcome, the wicked human heart. And maybe Noah's the guy who's going to crush evil and fix everything, and he doesn't. He ends up just like Adam, drunk in his own garden, in shameful nakedness. He is not the solution to the problem. And then we get to the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, and what we find is that humanity is saying, rather than spreading out and filling the earth like God wants us to, what we're going to do is we're going to gather together, build a tower to make our name great. And everyone at this time spoke one language, and so God says, nope, that ain't happening. You need to spread out, because the earth can't be covered with the glory of God if humanity stays in one place, right? And so he confuses their language, and they all spread out, which is good, because it's fulfilling God's command to spread out and fill the earth. But there's a major problem with that. Do you guys remember what it is? This is the third major problem of the narrative. They spread out, but they don't know God. And so we're introduced to this third major problem. We've got death and cursing of the land, the wicked human heart, which has continued since the flood. And now we've got the lack of knowledge of God among the nations. And so they're spreading out and speaking different languages, but they don't know the Lord. And so what is God going to do about this? When you get to the end of chapter 11, it's not looking great. It really isn't looking great. And then you get to chapter 12, and God starts the freshest new beginning in the narrative so far by calling this guy, this is session 4, by calling this guy named Abram. Abram, this guy would have been a 75-year-old pagan from Iraq. Not a likely candidate who we would think for God to use, right? But he says, Abram, let's go to the land that I'm going to call you to. So pick up your family, pick up all your stuff, get moving. He would have been in Mesopotamia at this time. Let's go over to the land of Canaan. And then when he gets there, God makes this, well, actually, it's in Genesis 12 and then reiterated in Genesis 15. But God makes this promise to Abraham. He says, Abraham, I'm going to promise you 3 things. Do you guys remember what they are? The 3 parts of the Abrahamic covenant? Okay, good. Land, blessing, seed or descendants, right? So he says, Abram, you have no kids, but I'm going to give you a lot of descendants, and they're going to inhabit this land, all for the sake of blessing all the families of the whole earth. So again, we can see God trying to get back to that master plan, right, of covering the earth with his glory through human partners. Abram is this human partner. And God says, you're going to have many descendants, and they, through your one family, I'm going to bless all the families of the earth. So this is looking really, really good. Then in the rest of Genesis, chapters 25 through 50, chapters 25 through 50, we have the story of Abraham's descendants. He has this one son called Isaac. Isaac has a son called Jacob. And then Jacob has 12 sons, right? One of whom is Joseph. But what we see is with these sons, God doesn't just make this promise to Abraham, and then say, it's kind of just for you. No, he continues this covenant fidelity, continues this covenant faithfulness on down through the generations. And what we find is that in Abraham's descendants, if we really want to know what it means to walk with God, to be a covenant partner with God, number one, you have to trust God. Going all the way back to Genesis, that's what they didn't do, right? You guys tracking with me? Are we here tonight? Okay. They didn't trust God. So in order to be a covenant partner with God, you have to trust him. It's what we call faith. You have to trust him. But then, number 2, you got to show hospitality. It's not just about like believing certain doctrines or whatever. If you're not hospitable, you're not reflecting God. Because God is generous. He is hospitable. He is welcoming. He is kind and gracious. So if we say we are partners with that God, we have to do the same thing. And Isaac, Jacob, they display this very well, and Abraham as well. And so by the time you get to the end of Genesis with Joseph, which is Abraham's great-grandson, The story has taken us down to Egypt, where Joseph now lives, right, because of a famine. He saves his whole family by the favor of the Lord in Egypt, and then Genesis ends. And then we get to Exodus, which picks up right where Genesis left off. Right where Genesis left off. Thanks for fixing the slides, Adam, wherever you are. In Exodus, we find the people of God who were once shown favor by the Pharaoh who liked Joseph. There is arisen a new Pharaoh who knows not Joseph. And he's like, why are we showing favor to these people? Let's enslave them. Let's make them work very hard in order to build our empire. And we're introduced here in Exodus to what we call this tale of two kingdoms. This tale of two kingdoms. Two ways of looking at the world. We call them empire and shalom. Shalom runs on trust in God. It has a generosity mindset. Like, there is enough to go around, so of course I would give my stuff away to other people. Of course I would be generous. Of course I wouldn't just look out for number one. Of course I'd be welcoming toward people. That's who our God is. Empire, on the other hand, is completely different. Empire says, no, you do need to look out for you, because God's not going to make you your daily bread, and other people aren't either, so you better get about it. And you really should just look out for yourself. There isn't enough to go around, so amass whatever you can all to yourself. You should trust nobody but you. That's Egypt. Shalom is God's way. And so, really, in Exodus, and then we talked about it in Judges as well, we're introduced to the fourth major problem of the narrative. Fourth major problem. How is God going to overcome all these problems to bring shalom back to the world? How is he going to overcome death and cursing of the land? The propensity of the human heart to be wicked, like everybody. The lack of knowledge of God among the nations. And then fourth, how is he going to solve this problem of his people being under the oppressive rule of men? The oppressive rule of men, men oppressing each other. What is he going to do about that? And so, while Israel is being oppressed in Egypt, God actually begins to show them favor and to build up their numbers. They become a nation from a 70-person family at the end of Genesis. Now they're, in hundreds of thousands of people. And so Pharaoh says, this is actually a danger to us, because if they rise up and revolt, they could really hurt the empire. So make them work harder, enslave them, be brutal toward them. And they cry out to God. God hears their cry. He looks down upon his people in their groaning and their hurt, and he sees and he knows. He sees and he knows. And so he decides to be faithful to the covenant and act. Exodus 6 through 15, God comes and delivers his people with miracles. He calls Israel his firstborn son. He leads them out in triumph over the Egyptian gods. And then we saw in the Passover and in the Red Sea crossing that Israel really is birthed, if you will, as God's firstborn son, who's going to bring his name to the nations. He's going to bring God to the nations and bless all the families of the earth. And then once they get out of Egypt, God leads them into the desert and gives them our next major covenant, which is the Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant. So we've had the covenant with Adam, Noah, Abraham, and now Moses. And we said with the law that the law is much more than God just giving rules. That's a bad idea. That's not the heart of God. God says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially propose to you, my people, as to be my spouse, to be my partner in making something of the world and putting the pieces of this broken world back together. Will you accept my proposal? And Israel says yes. And so God gives the 10 words or the 10 commandments, these kind of generalized moral commands, and then the judgments, which is the rest of the law or the instruction, which is those 10 words applied to different situations, right? And God says, if you will keep this law, you will fulfill your identity, which is you will be my treasured possession. You will be a holy nation in that you are consecrated in service to me, and then you will be a kingdom of priests. You will show the entire world what it's like to know the living God and what it's like to treat each other how God would have us treat each other. Right relationship with God, right relationship with people. And Israel, again, accepts this proposal. When we get to Leviticus, which is where we started this spring, in the book of Leviticus, which is another one we are very quick to overlook, what we find is all of these covenant regulations from God about how to approach him in worship and how to be the holy people that he has called them to be. And at the center of Leviticus, which actually ends up being the chiastic center of the entire Pentateuch, Genesis to Deuteronomy, we find this Day of Atonement. The one day a year when the high priest would go into the very presence of God in the tabernacle and atone for the sins of the people. And so at the heart of the Pentateuch, what we see is not a God who says, stay away from me, I don't like you, I don't have your good in mind. What we see is a God who says, I want you near. But because of my holiness and because of your sin, some things have to happen in order for you to draw near. And so he provides the way for us to draw near to him. We also see in Leviticus regulations for the tabernacle, which was essentially this mobile dwelling of God among his own people. And we saw, in that study of Leviticus, we saw all this imagery in the tabernacle that all points back to the Garden of Eden, right? When God dwelt with his people, and then sin, we're kicked out, and now God says, no, I will dwell with my people. And so the tabernacle is built, and it points back to this kind of Edenic state. Like that's where God is bringing us back to, right? But the core theme of Leviticus is holiness, again, so that we can draw near to God and be a holy nation in the midst of all the nations of the earth. After he gives the law, God begins leading his people through the desert onto the promised land. And so if the giving of the law was like the wedding ceremony, then Numbers is like the honeymoon. Numbers is like the honeymoon. And what we find out is that this honeymoon does not go great. It doesn't go great. The people, this generation who has come out of Egypt, kind of shockingly, they just have a really hard time trusting God. They don't trust him. They constantly put God to the test and refuse to believe that he will provide for them, that he will be good for them. And so because of their obstinate unbelief, God says, you cannot be the generation that takes the promised land. If you're acting like this now, you can't be the ones for this next chapter, and so you're all going to die in the wilderness because of your unbelief. That's really the key. It's not just that they were doing bad things. They didn't trust God. From that flowed these actions of mistrust, right? But they don't trust God, and so he says you're going to die in the wilderness, including, sadly, Moses. Moses doesn't believe God, and in an act of unbelief and disobedience, lashes out, strikes the rock, right? Instead of speaking to it, and God says, because of your unbelief, you also will die in the wilderness. And so when you get to Deuteronomy, what you see is Moses giving the law again as his kind of final speech before the people take the promised land and before he dies. And so we saw in Deuteronomy that the most important instruction, which is the Shema, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Nothing more important you can do than that. We saw warnings of consequences for covenant unfaithfulness, where God says, if you go into this land and you forget that it was I who gave all this to you, you forget these words of this instruction to obey them, you forget me, you reject me, you start serving the gods of the land, then these punishments will fall upon you. In Deuteronomy 27 and 28. And what we see as we get on to Kings and Chronicles, that is exactly what happens. But then Moses also says this interesting thing about circumcising their hearts. He says, if you want to follow the Lord, what you need to do is you need to circumcise your heart. And I know that you won't do it. And so you need God to change your own heart. And so it's kind of this allusion to what God will do in the future, right? But he says, man, you guys need to change your hearts. And so on the borders of the promised land, Mount Nebo, Moses, the great leader, dies. And Joshua takes his place. And thus we get to the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua. The book of Joshua is a hard one for a lot of people because of the violence within. But what we see is that as this new generation takes the promised land through conquest, what God is concerned about is not just exterminating a people that aren't his chosen people. Like, I don't like you just because you're not Israel. No, that's not God's heart at all. The real threat in the land was their idols, their idolatry. The problem was not their ethnicity, the Canaanites' ethnicity. The problem was their ethics, their gross immorality that had persisted for centuries. God had given them 700 years to change their ways, and instead they say, no, we're going to keep sacrificing our kids in the fire, and we're going to keep practicing all this sexual immorality that is gross immorality. And so God says, okay, I've given you time. The door of mercy is shut. The door of judgment is now open, and he uses his people to accomplish that. But the reason he wants his people to drive out Israel from the land, not drive out Israel. The reason he wants his people to drive out the Canaanites from the land is because of their idols. Because if their idols have the victory in Israel, then this whole thing is shot. Who's going to bless the nations if not Israel? Who's going to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation and partner with God to put the world back together and cover the earth with God's glory? Who's going to do that if not Israel? And so God says, drive these people out. We spent a week also looking at the geography of Israel. It's called it the crossroads of the earth. Where does God plant his people? Of all the places on earth that he could have chosen, he chooses this little strip of land that lies between Africa, Asia, and Europe, where all the major trade routes went right through there, in order to communicate to Israel that your job is not to recede into the hill country of Judea when these massive armies and trade caravans and all this is coming through. Your job is to engage. Your job is to engage. I'm going to put you at the center of all of the action so that you can bring God to everybody and be a blessing to all nations. And we found that their geography is what made their mission possible. Their geography is what made their mission possible. Now, after we studied that, after Joshua, we get into the period of Judges and Ruth. And so they're poised to make this massive impact on the world for God, to bring Yahweh to the nations. And then we turn to Judges. And man alive, it does not go as planned. We thought this generation would be way better than the generation that died in the wilderness, and they are not. They're captivated by the idols of the land, these other gods. Their hearts are led astray, and they keep going into this. There's this cycle that we talked about in the book of Judges, right? They fall into sin. God sends another kind of nation around them to judge them and to oppress them. And then in that oppression, they cry out to God, okay, God, we're sorry, save us. And then God sends a judge, kind of a local ruler or deliverer. And as long as that judge is alive, and if they're faithful, the people will walk in faithfulness. But when the judge dies, they just go right back to their idolatry. You guys remember this? And so we said the cycle here is not just a sin cycle. It's a very pessimistic, one-sided way of looking at this, like it's all about Israel's sin. No, because what we see is God redeeming them as well and being unbelievably gracious. And so this, even with that truth, this does end up as one of the darkest times in Israel's history. And what we see coming out of the Judges is this leadership crisis. You guys with me? Okay. We see this leadership crisis, and I mentioned it just a few seconds ago, but as long as Israel has a leader, they're good. If they don't have a leader, they fall into sin and idolatry. And so they need someone who can lead them in faithfulness. And then in the book of Ruth, it's kind of this bright light in the midst of all this darkness and shadow and mist, where Ruth is a story about faithfulness and about love and about kindness and redemption. And at the end of the book of Ruth, we see this small genealogy leading to this little kid named David. This little kid named David. And then we get to the book of Samuel. We covered Samuel in 2 weeks. But out of this leadership crisis comes the monarchy. The people demand a king. They say Samuel, who was the first prophet, last judge at the time. Samuel, give us a king so we can be like all the other nations, which we're like, red flag, Israel, hello, you're not supposed to be like all the other nations, right? And yet they demand a king, and God says, I will give them a king. You can have a king. It just has to be the king that I choose. We're going to have some criteria here for who this king should be and how this king should act. We saw this from Deuteronomy 17, right? Saul is given as the first king, but what we find as his rule, unfolds, we find that he's not a man after God's own heart. He's really only for himself. And so God says, okay, I'm going to raise up another king who will take your spot and who will be better than you. And David comes on the scene in the story of David and Goliath, and we find he's everything that Saul isn't. Everything that Saul isn't. He's this serpent-slaying, God-fearing, Kadush Hashem, if you remember that, right? Honoring the name. He's this young kid who does all of that. Everything that Saul wasn't. And so he comes along, replaces Saul, and then in the second part of our Samuel study, we saw that David, it's kind of this like golden age of faithfulness in the land during the early part of David's reign. And after they get settled and David defeats all the enemies surrounding Israel, he says, okay, God, I want to build you a house. I want to build you a house. And God says, you're not going to build me a house. Rather, I'm going to build you a house. And God makes with David what is called the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant. God would give David an eternal house. He would give him an eternal kingdom and an eternal throne. And so we saw that this type of king that God wants, he says, David, I'm going to give you a forever king. A forever king who's going to walk in obedience to Yahweh's Torah. So he's going to obey the law. He's going to fulfill the law, as it were. So he's going to walk in obedience to the Torah. He's going to solve Israel's leadership crisis by leading the people in faithfulness and by changing their own hearts. And then he's going to bring the nations to Yahweh. And this is, this part of the study, you guys, was just mind-blowing to me. I didn't really know where the Davidic covenant fit in all this story. I was like, yeah, God's just nice to David. I get Abraham, where he's like, well, let's put this thing back together. We're like, yes, let's do it. But then with David, I thought, what does that have to do with anything else? And we see, no, one is going to come, this son of David. He's going to change the hearts of the people. He's going to solve the leadership problem. He himself is going to be the model Torah citizen, and then his rule is going to have global repercussions. And so, naturally, when we read this, we're kind of looking at David like, is David the king that we need? Because God has made these massive promises, and David's doing pretty good so far. Is he the king that we need? And as his rule unfolds, we find, no, he's not the king that we need. His life falls apart, and his house falls apart. And that leads us to Kings and Chronicles. That should say Kings and Chronicles, not Samuel part 1, but Kings and Chronicles. In the Kings and Chronicles, we see the story of David's son, Solomon. And Solomon becomes super rich. We think he's going to be the offspring of David who's going to solve everything. And what we find is that, while he's super rich and he's been getting these great gifts of wisdom by God, he actually breaks all the rules of Kings in Deuteronomy 17. He acquires for himself many horses from Egypt, nonetheless, a lot of money, and a lot of wives. And his heart is led astray from the Lord into idolatry. And God says, because of your idolatry, this kingdom will not be united any longer. There will be strife after you between your son and Rehoboam, and then between Jeroboam as well, a leader in the kingdom. And then after Solomon, the kingdom splits into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And so, it's sad that we were so close. We were so close with David, and then with Solomon, the potential was so great for all the nations to be blessed. And now everything starts going downhill. The northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah, do not like each other. There is idolatry in the land. Lines of kings in Israel, none of them are the son of David. So the promise can't come through them, right? But they have no good kings in Judah. They just have a smattering of good kings. But even those kings, their problem is what? They die. And so they might lead the people in faithfulness for a little bit, but then they're dead. And the nation goes right back to where it was. But these two kingdoms decline. The northern kingdom, Israel, is completely wiped out by Assyria in 722 BC, never to be recovered. The bottom two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, go on down until Babylon decides to come in and destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry off the people into captivity. And with all these kings, we ask of every single one of them, is this the king that we need? Is this the king we need? And everyone, it's nope, nope. He was a good king, but now he's dead. Nope, nope, nope. And we're left at the end of Kings and Chronicles thinking, man, how are we ever going to get out of this? We saw in the book of Kings, Kings is written from the bottom looking up. And so Kings is written from exile going, man, it's your fault, you kings, your fault. Your idolatry, your immorality. This is how we got here. And Chronicles is written much later after the post-exilic period, after they decline and then come back out of exile. And Chronicles is asking, what is God going to do? And so you guys, just think about this narratively. Narratively, that is where we ended this semester. We have gone down to the exile. We have this glimpse from Chronicles, but we are in the exile. Things are not looking great. That's where the narrative portion kind of ends. And so for our last 5 sessions, what we did was we looked at the Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Job, and Ecclesiastes. And we said that these books stand apart from the narrative as this toolbox, if you will. Each one of these books gives us tools for living life well with God. And so if you want to live your life with any measure of success, if you want to live your life with wisdom, each one of these books has something to offer you. And we saw from the Psalms that tool is singing. It's song. The Psalms is a compilation of poetry, right, from many different authors. But it's really also a canonical history telling the story of God from David on down to the exile and then coming out of the exile as well. But the Psalms give words to our worship. They give words to our worship, and not just the happy praise anthem kind of songs, but also lament psalms. Psalms of anger, psalms of hurt, psalms of depression, psalms of confusion. It gives words to all of those things. And so we said, if we want to get through this life right, if we want to get through it well, we should let the Psalms speak for us as we express ourselves to God in worship. Right? So singing, that's the tool that we get from the Psalms. Then we looked at Proverbs and Song of Solomon. Proverbs and Song of Solomon. And we said that the tool that Proverbs gives us is wisdom. Proverbs defines life kind of simply. It says, if you're wise, you'll be blessed. And if you're stupid, you're not going to be blessed. So choose wisdom. Because wisdom has to do with everything in your life. It's not just some kind of cognitive faculty that we have. Wisdom touches every moment of your daily life, everything. And so choose wisdom. You want to get through life, you got to walk wisely. But then Song of Solomon celebrates marriage and sexuality, and Song of Solomon gives us the importance of relationships. Primarily in that book, obviously marriage. But for those who aren't married, that book still has the gift of friendship and relationship to you. Like, you need this if you're going to get through life. You cannot isolate yourself, right? And so we've got singing, wisdom, relationships, and then we got to the book of Job. And Job acknowledges the reality of innocent suffering, that sometimes life isn't as simple as kind of what Proverbs makes it. Like, do the right thing, and then it'll all work out. Don't do the right thing, and it's not going to work out. Job says, no, sometimes things come into your life that are inexplicable, that aren't due to your sin. It's not a reaping and sowing kind of consequence, because certainly that's true. We've all been there. You do something dumb, and then you reap the consequence, and you're like, yeah, well, I brought this on myself. Job's like, no, sometimes it's not that. And you have these why questions God, why am I dealing with this? Why am I not feeling fulfilled? Why am I suffering in this way? Why is this my burden and not everybody else's? Because it seems like it's harder for me in this regard than everybody else. Why? And then God shows up at the end of Job and he says, Job, I'm not going to always answer your why questions. In fact, in this case, I'm not going to answer your why questions, but I will be enough for you. I will be enough for you. And at the end of the book, Job just says, man, I found fault with God, and who was I to do that? You cannot find fault with God. And so I will shut my mouth and I will worship the Lord. And in the end, God proves to be enough for Job, even though Job didn't have all the answers to his suffering. And then finally, just last week, we ended with the book of Ecclesiastes. And that's it's not working anymore. The book of Ecclesiastes. On top of the suffering question, Ecclesiastes adds to this wisdom tradition. It rounds off the wisdom literature from the scriptures, and Ecclesiastes says, sometimes life just isn't easy to understand. And so Ecclesiastes is wrestling with suffering too, but it's more of an internal suffering, not a suffering that comes from without with your circumstances. He's just asking, where do you even find meaning in life? Because life doesn't make sense. It's here and then it's gone. And sometimes bad things happen to good people. And you can't always, it's not as simple as Proverbs makes it, right? It's hevel. Remember that word, hevel? It's like smoke. It's here and then it's gone. It's puzzling, right? But the author of Ecclesiastes, after searching for meaning in all different areas of his life, what he finds at the end is that life isn't a meaning free-for-all. It's not just like, just kind of make it up as you go and do your best. No, he says there is meaning, and it's found in God. And so when you're faced with the confusing nature of life, the best thing to do is not to worry, not to give yourself over to anxiety, not to give up on life, but number one, you just need to remember God. Remember that he holds all things in his hand. And we cannot understand why he does all that he does or when he does all that he does. But he is in control. And so number one, remember God. And then number two, relinquish control up to him. Just give him control over the things in your life that you can't control anyway. And what you find if you do that is that when you give all of that to the Lord, you get to receive all of it back as a gift. And you and I can wake up every day and just say, today is enough. And today is a gift from the Lord. And so I'm just going to accept it as a gift from God. And it rounds off the wisdom literature given to us. And so the 5 tools we get from the wisdom literature: Psalms, song; Proverbs, wisdom; Song of Solomon, relationships; Job, trust; and then Ecclesiastes, meaning. And so if you take those 5 tools, that's a pretty good place to start in living a life with God that is lived well, right? And so that's where we've ended this semester. And I know that's all really quick, and it's a lot of information. And if you've been coming, you're like, yeah, I know that. Good. It's time for us to know it again, right? Review is a good thing. But here's the plan for this study. We're going to take a break this summer. Men's and women's ministries are going to do their thing. We split in the summer, do our own studies. When we come back in September, about 4 months from now, we're going to pick up with the prophets and all these men called by God to speak to his people, enforce the covenant as the people are going down to exile and then as they're coming out of it as well. And so I've been praying that you guys would be blessed through this study. I've been praying that you guys would just enjoy it too, that Wednesday nights would be worth it for you. And so now it's time for me to get my head around the prophets this summer so that I can come back in the fall and give you guys something that's worth something, okay? But I do hope you are blessed. And if you're new, I hope that this review is helpful. If you guys ever have any questions, please come up and ask me. I'd be happy to answer those. And for you equipping track students who are doing homework and things on top of coming here, the final project will be uploaded this week. And you have 4 months to work on it, so there's no rush, okay? Take the whole summer to do it. All right, that's enough talking from me. Our kids are ready to come in. And so let me just pray really quick, and then I will hand it over to our kids' ministry directors. Father, we are grateful this evening to review your story, that you have a plan for the world and you plan to put everything back together through your people. And even when it gets rocky, God, you remain faithful, committed to the mission, gracious, perfectly just and righteous in everything. And so tonight, as we reflect on that story, God, I pray that these men and women would be blessed. I pray that they would love your word and grow deeper in love with it as we study. And so we're excited to celebrate our kids now, be honored. God, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.